Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Dami Adewale. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be talking about systems change and the role charity leaders need to play when their programs are trying to achieve it.
So what are we talking about here? Systems change is a term that can be used and is often used interchangeably. But for the purposes of this discussion, in the simplest possible terms, it's about addressing the root causes of a problem in the system or society surrounding it. And achieving systems change is becoming an ever more popular goal among charities and their funders. But how can it be achieved? And what needs to change within many organisations to make it happen successfully?
We have two guests to help us answer these questions. First up is Emma Revie, Co-Chief Executive of the food bank network Trussell. Hello, Emma.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
And also with us is the strategy and change management specialist, Martyn Drake. And Martyn has been hosting a series of fascinating webinars with charity leaders, including Emma, over the past few months, asking some of the big questions facing charities, such as what do you do when demand routinely outstrips supply and the services on offer? Hi, Martyn.
Hello, nice to be here.
Well, it's lovely to have you both with us. So in the context of that very real challenge facing a lot of charities at the moment, why, Martyn, in your view, do you think the sector should be thinking about systems change?
I think it's a natural evolution from recognising what you said about the demand outstripping our ability to meet it, and therefore having to think more deeply about how do we prevent these issues. There are other factors involved. So I've worked with a number of organisations who've kind of recognised that when they look at their vision statement, which says a world in which, or in this case, for instance, the UK doesn't need food banks, as charities working and delivering services or delivering interventions doesn't necessarily lead us directly towards that world. Sometimes it can prop up the status quo. And so there are a number of different drivers, I guess, for people to start thinking more in terms of systemic change. But probably the main one is the fact that we simply can't reach all the need with the resources that we potentially have available.
So then that means that for a charity, for example, like Trussell, giving out food parcels, food aid, that's simply not a sufficient way of dealing with the problems, and other things need to be looked at, right, Emma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the trigger, as Martyn says, for having these kind of conversations. I remember one of our food bank managers saying really powerfully when in a conversation with somebody talking about the challenges that had brought them to that food bank, just feeling the weight of insufficiency of handing that parcel over and thinking this parcel's not going to address any of those issues. It's a short-term sticking plaster, but the wound remains 3 days later when the food parcel is finished. So you have to ask yourself, when that is happening time and time and time again, and in our case, 3 million times last year, what's actually going on? What is the nature of the problem here? And how can we start tackling that rather than just placing a sticking plaster over a wound that is never healing?
And that's a good segue onto what Trussell is doing then, Emma. So could you tell us, how is Trussell driving systems change?
I think probably the first thing to say is we're trying to drive systems change, because one of the things to accept up front is this is complex. It's really difficult. It's hard work. And I think for lots of charities, particularly where you're facing overwhelming need day in, day out, it's very hard to get the space physically or mentally to step back and think, what is the system I'm in and what is my place in that system and how can I best be operating? We have done some deep thinking in that space, really just through that weight of that sense of insufficiency of a food parcel to tackle the needs that we're seeing day in, day out. And so I think partly what we've done is some deep thinking about what is actually driving food bank use. What is the actual problem? Not what are one of the symptoms of that problem, which is people not being able to afford food, but what's actually underlying that. And through our research and through speaking to people who are coming through the doors of our food banks and that kind of wider research, we've understood what the key drivers are of hunger and hardship in the UK. And we know that the scale of it is far bigger than we even see in our food banks. So being able to be clear on what the problem is, and it's not a food problem. It's not necessarily lack of access to food. It is people not being able to afford the essentials, one of which is food. And so being able to just articulate really clearly, this is the problem. It's about poverty. It's about deep poverty, the type of poverty that leaves you unable to afford the essentials. And so at that point, you're widening the system that you're looking at. And within that system, there are many, many other charities operating where they are supporting people who find themselves unable to afford the essentials. So I think the next thing we've done is articulate who we should be operating with, who should be our partners that we work with, because we're all supporting the same group of people who are facing those same barriers. And also then being able to understand that there are some people who are more likely to be facing that problem. So calling out those systemic issues. When 75% of people coming to food banks come from a household where either they themselves are disabled or someone else in the household is disabled, that is a massive alarm bell. It's something systemically that is going wrong in our society that we should be addressing. So understanding what is driving food bank use, understanding who else is working to support those people and identifying those key barriers, and then framing the solutions that would see those barriers removed, would stop as many people having to come to food banks, and then working through advocacy, through campaigning, through partnerships with other charities to try and ensure that we are putting in place the right solutions, not sticking plaster solutions. That sounds great when you articulate it like that. It's really hard, messy, difficult work, and we get lots of stuff wrong. I think would be important to say.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that you've laid out so clearly and simply the challenges and then the ways that you are working to tackle those challenges. But obviously, this is a hugely complex and enormous problem that you're seeking to address. It's not just about poverty and food poverty. Charities working in all types of cause areas will be facing the same kind of challenges. So Martyn, from your perspective of working with charities sort of across the board in multiple cause areas, why is it so difficult to try to go beyond alleviating the really immediate problems?
I think Emma's just touched on it there with it's complex. And Trussell have spent a long time really trying to understand what are the drivers of people using food banks, what are the drivers of food poverty. And I spoke last week, you mentioned that the little series of seminars I've been doing last time was with, included Matt Downey from Crisis, and they've done a similar huge piece of research trying to understand not just what's driving homelessness, their area of focus, but what are the solutions out there. As I mentioned, it is a problem of complexity because you're dealing with lots of factors that create these outcomes, these bad outcomes for people. But the second thing is it really requires you to move from campaigning about stuff to solving stuff and demonstrating solutions. And that's where, one of the things that Matt talked about in our conversation was there's a comfort zone, I guess, in being known as a campaigning organisation. That's what you do. You point out all the problems, and it's quite a big shift. It's a big shift of confidence to then step into that space to say that we are going to have to pull this insights from all over the world about what works where, etc., and try and demonstrate and create these solutions within the UK that show the economic benefit, that show the long-term transition, that show the sustainability, that show all these things. There's a big sort of confidence piece for organisations, not just to grapple with the complexity, to really understand, to create a theory, as Emma's got us, how this stuff can be addressed, how the root causes can be resolved, but then to start to shift your role into much more of a demonstrator and an organisation that will convene other organisations, that will share these solutions, that will go for adoption. I think one final point while I'm on a roll, one of the other conversations that I had was Ndidi Okizi, who's former chief exec of UK Youth. One of the things that she got very passionate about was how many non-profit organisations will create and demonstrate solutions. They'll get a grant, they'll do a solution, they'll write a report, and it'll sit on their website, and it won't scale. And it won't scale because they're not getting out there and selling it and marketing it, and nobody else in the particular sphere is looking for these innovations to try and adopt. So whereas in a business world, good innovations, they get scaled because somebody will buy the organisation, they'll get acquired, it'll get scaled. Within the non-profit world, we tend not to scale these solutions. So all of these factors kind of combine, along with things like, if you're shifting into solutions from campaigning, You've got to take your donors with you. You've got to take your supporters with you. You've got to take your board with you. There's a whole load of consequences. What happens next once you say you're serious about systems change that can feel quite daunting for leaders.
Emma, I think you've spoken generally about the challenges that charities can face in terms of tackling systems change, but Trussell's quite clearly trying to go beyond providing food parcels and addressing the root causes of poverty. But have there been any sticking points in this drive?
Oh yeah, many. It's been a real challenge. And I think probably the one that presents itself day in and day out is that desire to focus on the individual who's in front of you and providing their immediate needs, and the overwhelm that can come from the increased levels of need we're seeing, the logistical challenges about doing that well, and balancing that with the other side of the seesaw, which is, if we can be tackling some of the systemic drivers of why somebody is here, we will ultimately reduce the number of people who are coming. We will make it that if somebody's had to come once, they don't have to come again. But being able to prioritise that over somebody who is in front of you in crisis is an almost impossible daily challenge. And I think what you find in many charities, I'm sure this will resonate with them, what you find is our people stretch themselves thinner and thinner trying to do both all the time. And so giving permission to one another in that structure to think about the actual long-term implications of if we can create the systems change for people, the real life implications of that for individuals, and helping people to hold on to that as they push through the more complex work, the longer term work where you might not see an immediate return on investment. And I think so that's the experience for a volunteer or for a member of staff in a food bank, but also it scales up for us on a macro level as well, because if you're having a conversation sometimes with a donor, you might find that conversation is much easier if you're talking about short-term impact. It's more present, it's more visceral, it can be seen. When you steer them away from that conversation to the longer term work that takes more time, is less successful in the short term, will fail and then fail again, and then will maybe be successful. But we know and believe will have much better longer term impact. Those are more complex conversations. They're harder to sum up in 2 sentences or 100 words. They take 5 or 6 sentences or 200 words. And so I think it's a constant tension. And also I think one of the things I always think about in these situations is it's not to devalue the short-term work. Encountering someone with compassion and solidarity when they're in a deep and dark moment is a deeply transformative activity. It's an important thing to do. And I think you may not be as easily able to track the systems change impact of that type of encounter, but actually it is there if you look below it as well. And so I think there's lots of organisations who might not be as easily able to signpost their systems change work, but the way in which they do their work, the way in which they encounter people, is actually really important. And so often we diminish the sticking plaster activity, in inverted commas, when it is in and of itself very important. But I think that's a challenge.
I think just building on what Emma said there, one of the things that impresses me most about Trussell, I'm not just saying this because you're here, I've said this to other people, is the way that they create the narrative of what you learn from those front end conversations with people using food banks, the amount of insight that you gain in terms of what's driving their situation, the data that you collect on recurring, whether people come back after they've taken advice from your partners, people like Citizens Advice and that sort of thing on how to claim benefits and these sort of things, the impact that has, and the way that then that you use that data to drive the way that you inform systems change work, I think is incredibly powerful. And then the way that you link that back through your own narratives, you've talked me through this before, to help to explain to the people on the front lines why it's so important to capture this insights, to capture that data, and to build it back through into the narrative, and how that whole story works, I think is really powerful. And I think you do it as well as anybody that I've come across in the sector.
Oh, bless you. Thank you, Martyn. Another Martyn, Martyn Johnson, who works with us on developing our work in participation, very early on in my time at Trussell, talked about an infinity loop between compassion and justice, which I think about almost every day. And the two are interconnected. And I think that immediate encounter, compassionate encounter, you kind of move through that round the infinity loop into justice and back into compassion. If you're just being compassionate, but you're not calling out the systemic injustices, that I think lessens the compassion. It stops being compassion and could tip easily into complicitness in a system that is failing people. But similarly, if you just focus on justice and don't remember compassion, then you lose something. That justice will be ill-formed and have lost something. And so I think what you just described there, Martyn, of how we work, we try to always make that an ever-referring loop of infinity, where justice is informing compassion and compassion is informing justice. And I think that's really important.
But do you ever find, or have you found, that you're needing to undertake the longer term, perhaps the justice work, at the expense of the sticking plaster work that you began when you started out as a charity?
We try to make those decisions always in light of our long-term vision, and also in partnership with and in discussion with people who directly access our services. You have to have those conversations repeatedly and be thinking deeply about it. If I think about an example where need is increasing and the pressures on our services for emergency food, not even the additional services we provide, but on emergency food. If that is going to stop you being able to campaign for or speak to the underlying drivers of why people are coming to food banks, or stop you being able to provide advice services that tackle those needs underneath, then we have to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of how we provide food? There's something we might need to change. We don't want to distract from the longer term work just to make the delivery of our food prettier or shinier or swifter. So we might not compromise on the longer term for the how we deliver food. But if it is compromising people's encounter, that warmth of welcome that people would experience when they come through the door of a food bank, where we're upholding people's dignity in that process, I think then that does present you with a real challenge. That cannot be compromised. So I think you always identify the things you're trying to do almost in a hierarchy, and being really clear about where they sit in that hierarchy. We can't do everything, and that is probably the most common conversation I have with people in our food banks. We beat ourselves up often about wanting to do more and support more people, and this problem is not of our making, and we're doing our very best to support as many people as we can for as long as we're needed to. But actually, the responsibility we have is to signpost where responsibility lies, what the long-term solutions are. And we can only do as much as we can do. But when we're prioritising what we do, we need to be thinking about it in the light of that long-term strategy. Is this activity bringing us closer to ending the need for food banks? Or could it be propping up what is already there instead, in which case we shouldn't be doing it?
What I'd add to that, undoubtedly there is a tension between meeting the need in front of you and working upstream to resolve it. But actually, the more organisations that I work with and the more that I observe, is the better that they understand the system and the upstream work, the less it's about attention and the more it's about a change in the way that they deliver. So, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. So one will be in Trussell, for example. With, I think you gave me this example, Emma, that if you were just about delivering food parcels, then one of the things you might want to do is reduce the stigma of people using a food bank. And actually, long-term aim is that that's not what you want to do. You want to actually reduce the existence of food banks. Another example would be, Matt Downey's talked about this before, and so is Polly Neat as well. There is, within homelessness, there is a recognition, an increasing body of data that suggests that temporary accommodation is not a long-term solution. But it doesn't help people transition out of homelessness. It forms part of the cycle. And Polly described it as being, the first thing that we need to do once you start to understand the system is to make sure that you're not complicit, using Emma's words. So that you certainly, you're not creating a dependency or a bad loop within the system that actually does not create the outcomes that you want. And a third example that I would give, there's an organisation I worked with a number of times called Brook, international animal welfare. So they look after horses, donkeys and mules, working animals, within various different parts of the world. And when they started, kind of, back in the 1920s, one of the first things that they did was to introduce free veterinary services for places like in Cairo, where they've got working horses, and in Petra in Jordan, where they use donkeys to take tourists around. And quite often, in the olden days, they weren't looked after, so they offered free vet care. They'd established these free vet clinics. And what they realised is that as they grew and their fundraising grew, and it allowed them to create more of these free clinics, that they sort of looked at the scale of the problem. There's 100 million working equines in the world. And at best, they could reach maybe 1 million of them. If they doubled their fundraising, maybe they can never get to 100 million. They couldn't provide that same model of support. So they started to ask themselves the question, this is probably going back about 15 years now, what would it take in order for us to be able to withdraw from a place? What is our end game in Jordan or in Luxor or wherever it is that we are? How do we exit? And they identified 4 things that needed to be in place. And they were around the people who look after the animals and the legal infrastructure, etc. But one of them was the services that were available for people who have working animals. So farriers for leather work and vets. Vets was one of them. And the fact that they provided a free vet service meant that no other vets could exist within that region, within that area, because they had no opportunity to develop a business. So them being there, being present in this 1920s model of giving free vet care, created a dependency which stopped them withdrawing. It created what Emma was describing as a bad outcome. So until they shifted their model, which is what they were known for, providing free vet care, it's what their supporters donated for, but until they stopped doing that and started working in a more systemic way, they could never address anything like the scale that they needed to. So that was a big change for them. So quite often when you start to do the research and understand the upstream, it changes the type of delivery that you do. So it often comes out as less about attention, a trade-off. It's more about how you do the frontline delivery rather than whether you do it.
So what was the more systemic solution in that?
So where Brook are, if you look at their new strategy, an awful lot of it is about working with human-based INGOs who, because the working animal is a huge part of that kind of local economy. And so if the human-based NGOs aren't considering the working animals in their work as well, that doesn't develop. But also Brook do now quite a lot of work with universities and training schools within the provinces they work to try and develop vets and try and help them establish on an enterprise model, actually working within communities and trying to develop the demand for people through understanding what's required for their working animals to bring the vets business. So they've shifted how their model works completely.
In our context, I think that's so relevant. And that's around never framing the problem as something that can be solved by food. And that's something we have to be very attentive to, because you could spend an inordinately large amount of time, as you said, Martyn, refining how it looks to deliver emergency food aid and framing it a different way and calling it a different thing. And I think there's lots of different organisations delivering food aid in slightly different ways, and they're all doing it to meet the need that's in front of them. But collectively, we need to be saying, only for as long as this is needed, because this is insufficient. There's no model of food aid provision that is okay. And I think by being clear on that and speaking with one voice on that, and never taking money from the people who hold the real solutions to enable that, and that is quite important. If you're in a conversation with a solution holder, not be taking cash for the temporary fix, but asking them to use their money on the long-term solutions has been a really important part of our journey, just being really clear on that with ourselves and with our partners.
And even down to the order that you include those things in your own mission statement.
Yeah.
So your mission statement is?
Well, we start with, so previously our mission statement started with, we provide 3 days of emergency food and support whilst working together to bring about a future where nobody needs a food bank to get by. And as we went through our rebranding exercise over the last couple of years, we were like, but what we're about is ensuring that nobody has to use a food bank. So we put that now at the top of our mission statement. And then we say, and whilst we're doing that, for as long as we're needed, we're providing emergency food and support. That is the secondary thing that we're having to do because the thing we're working towards has not yet been achieved. That was quite a profound moment where what we said about ourselves on the outside actually reflected who we are on the inside.
And I just wanted to talk to the both of you about the specific role of leaders. So could you just talk to us about the different and best ways of sharing power to drive systems change and how to address the root causes of an ever increasing demand?
I think first and foremost, I see so many incredible examples of leaders, and I've learned so much from different leaders across our sector. I think Martyn has been interviewing lots and lots of different people, all of whom are people I really look up to and have learned a lot from. And that model of seeking to work collaboratively and in partnership is deeply rooted in systems change. Once you've identified the system, the level of change that is needed, and you look out and see all these other incredible people motivated by that same passion and vision, working in that same field, then I think as leaders, our responsibility is to remove all barriers to collaboration, making it as easy as possible for us to be working together. And I often talk about mission before ego, whether that's individual ego, organizational ego, historic ego of we've always been the organization that did this. You need to be able to jettison all of that in pursuit of the mission if you want to create systems change, because the system is too big. The level of change necessary is too vast for any one of us to do it on our own. So I think the first characteristic that I most admire in leaders who are involved in systems change is that willingness to invest in relationship with one another, to set aside individual organizational priorities in pursuit of shared missional priorities. And there's so many great examples of leaders across our sector doing that work, and it's harder and it's longer, and you have to kind of take a lot of people with you, because it may be easier in the short term to do something on your own, and you'll get a boost in your brand if you do that, and maybe donors will really like it. But is it actually achieving the change you want to achieve for as many people as you want to achieve it for? Probably not. Whereas investing in relationships, working to create a co-produced plan, both with other partners and also people who are directly affected by circumstances, doing that long-term work means the actual work you end up doing over the long term is much more effective, much more impactful. But your logo might be nowhere near it. And we have to just celebrate that, because if the change happens, our charity has delivered its purpose. But people might not know we were involved, but that's okay, because that's not what we're here to do. We're not here to prop up our logos or our organisations. We're here to create change.
And I think that's what makes it hard for a lot of leaders, because the pressures are there, with board of trustees and, financial accounts and that sort of thing, to have your logo on stuff and to be the biggest, or to have the stories to tell. And it is much harder. I've seen people do this in different ways successfully. In terms of building alliances and building partnerships, some people do it one-to-one. So I spoke with Lindsay McDonald from Magic Breakfast. They're a great example of systems change, actually. And Lindsay's style is very much kind of small groups, one-to-one, etc., whereas others will be big conveners. You get everybody in a room and you work it all out. And they can all work, but the key is, as Emma said, that systems change is a team sport. And therefore, you can't exert control over all of these other autonomous organizations. You have to incentivize, inspire, influence, bring people together and align agendas, which means that you need to flex. And that's quite hard. It's easier for a chief exec to collaborate because you've got that level of autonomy. It's much harder down the organization, because people within organizations, we are conditioned to do what we're told and to hit our targets, etc. And you're asking people further down the organization who are involved in collaboration to go out there and find solutions that work for your partners as well as for you. You have to empower them with a degree of flexibility. You have to give them agency and autonomy in order to be able to go out there and collaborate. And that's where I see sometimes organizations and coalitions coming slightly unstuck, is because it works great at a leader level, chief exec to chief exec level, but unless it's really cascaded down, which is quite a bit of culture change for a lot of organizations, a lot of capability development, unless you do that when the leaders move, as they do, and chief exec moves on, somebody else comes in, it can have a really destabilizing effect on partnerships and relationships. So building that down through the organization, investing in that culture and the capability of collaborating all the way down, I think is the key to making this stuff sustainable.
So true, Martyn. And there's something about codifying it, being very explicit that how we work is often more important than what we do, and those behaviours, codifying them right the way through the organisation, so as they understand, so as we all in a team understand that how we are engaging with a partner is a key output that we're looking for. That will be a successful outcome that will be celebrated within our organisation as being missional work. If we can articulate those things and start to codify those things so as they're less dependent on people and more hard-coded into the core outcomes we're trying to achieve, I think that's helpful. But I agree, it's easier one-on-one at chief executive level. It's more complex as you move through an organisation, but it can be done, and codifying that up front, saying this is part of what we're seeking to do here, is a really important stepping stone to that.
And what about when you've got that autonomy funneled down to perhaps lower levels within a charity, and there is an ability to be looking at the mission over the brand, over the egos, dropping the latter two. But you've got lots of different organisations with their own very specific missions and priorities. How do you make sure that you come together with a suitably simple and short list of priorities? For example, if you're talking to the government, or you just want to get the message out loud and clear, when inevitably different organisations are going to have different views on what's most important to them.
I think when you're looking at a broader coalition, so if I take, for example, our Essentials Guarantee campaign. So we launched that campaign with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So that deep work of collaboration between our two teams, we've been working on for a number of years now at all levels of the organisation, building that partnership. But the wider campaign is engaged with over 150 different charitable organisations. And I think how we've been able to draw people in is to be very specific about the thing we're trying to do together. Can you agree that driving much of the problems we're facing in all of these organisations, the fact that people cannot afford the essentials? Do you agree that this solution that we're proposing to put in place an essentials guarantee that's legislative, that ensures people's social security is set at a level that covers the cost of essentials, is something you can sign up to? And if so, are you happy that we will collectively act on these particular issues? When you have that clarity on a single point of collaboration that is about systems, and you agree the communication of that, what are the types of actions you will take together, you can build broad consensus. So I think you can build that wider coalition. I think that deeper, longer term systems work that can be done in partnership, if I think about our relationship with Joseph Rowntree Foundation or our relationship with Citizens Advice, takes hours and hours and weeks and months of working together to truly understand where are the points of synergy in our shared work. What more things could we be doing together that would be more impactful if we did it together? But then also real clarity about what are the things we do separately, that we can be more impactful alone, where we don't have a shared view potentially on what it is we should be doing, or how we take action in those situations. And I think it's more work to work in that way, but I find, and I have found time and time again, that it's a more powerful outcome that comes out the other end. It's better informed, it's more rounded, and people are more likely to listen, where more of us are saying the same thing together. So it's very much worth the investment.
Absolutely. But for that, I guess you've just got to have a strong convener, right? To be laying the ground of this is what our message is going to be.
Yeah. You have to invest the time in advance and after, so you can convene people quickly if you've already invested in those relationships over a longer period of time. And I think what I see across our sector is increasingly people investing in those kind of relationships. So as in the moment, for example, the recent disability cuts, people mobilised, organisations mobilise and work together with incredible synergy to fight something they knew was wrong, because they had worked together so many times before and invested in those relationships. And we knew how we should work together, where our points of synergy would be, and how we could most impactfully work. So I think it's a never-ending process of building those relationships.
From what I've seen, I would say that that's key. It's easy for us to kind of get distracted with process, but ultimately it's about trust. So if I give the example of Shaping the Future with Volunteering, the coalition that kind of created the Big Help Out, as Emma said, it's hard work. It might feel like more effort, but I would argue that you can achieve things collectively in those kind of spaces that you simply can't do as an organisation on its own. So one of their first breakthroughs was bringing together a lot of the surveys that we're doing across volunteers. So each organisation will typically survey its volunteers every so often, how you feel, how engaged are you. They came up with a set of questions, not the full list, but a short list of questions to insert into each of their volunteer surveys. And between them, it was it was an opt-in type thing, but most of the people in the coalition agreed to do it. And between them, they managed to serve probably more than half of the UK's volunteer population with the same questions. So the level of insight that they got. And I did a strategic review of the coalition about 18 months after this, and everybody that I spoke to about that said that if somebody had asked them to do it, if a government agency had suggested to it, said there would have been a million reasons why they couldn't do it, because it emerged from that coalition as the trust was built, the agenda emerged, and the momentum was there for them to start doing this stuff. They did it. They found solutions to all of those problems. And, the following year, they launched the Big Help Out. Again, a single organisation cannot achieve those things on its own. So yes, it is harder. And yes, it does deliver more profound impact. But ultimately, it allows you to do things that you simply could not achieve on your own.
Emma, you've spoken about Trussell's rebrand, but you've also recently announced a co-leadership model. So could you talk to us about how this fits into the story, if at all?
It's a really great question. We have just announced that, and it's really exciting. Matthew and I have worked together as deputy and CEO for many years. And actually, this is a realisation of the fact that partnership, formalising it more as co-CEO. And I think it does reflect the relational way we work at all levels of our work. We work in partnership with our food banks. We work in partnership with people who are accessing our services. And how do you meaningfully transfer power? A lot of what we're talking about in systems change is about identifying where there are imbalances in power, where inequity exists and has been allowed to fester and drive societal problems. And so we talk a lot about a meaningful transfer of power. And how do we act in that space where we hold more power? How do we transfer power? How do we build power in local communities amongst people who are accessing our services so as they can create the change they want to see in society? It's only as you ask this question now I'm thinking about that actually it is part of that way of working. How do we share power? How do we meaningfully transfer power? How do we model that amongst ourselves and within our network? But it formalises a partnership that is long-standing in Trussell, and I'm really excited about it.
Fantastic. Well, I think that is an excellent note to end it on. It's been such an interesting discussion. Emma, Martyn, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Martyn and Emma, and that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.